Welcome back to Sociology 227. This is Julian Go, video 2. In this video, I've got 3 tasks. First, I'm going to introduce you to Julian Go. Next, I'm going to show you how he takes the sociology of race and racialization we talked about in SOCY 226 and brings them to the postcolonial space. I'll give you some examples to make sense of that. Finally, I'll get you ready for your tutorials. Let's do it. Here you see Julian Go lecturing at Brown University in 2017. You can watch this lecture online. It's very similar to the one I'm going to give here. At the time of writing, it has 44,000 views. Mine tend to have 14. 2 of those are my mom and her friend Linda. Hi, Mom. Hi, Linda. Go is a social theorist, interested both in theorizing what colonialism is, if we are, in fact, past it, and what we should do in either case. In this manner, his thought relates to the 3 ways of thinking that I expressed in the last video: the materialist, post-structuralist, and psychoanalytic ways of theorizing postcolonialism. Go is also interested in how sociology relates to the colonial present. How do we and how should we think about sociology in light of imperialism? We'll look to the example of Pierre Bourdieu later in this video. Go's goal is a post-colonial sociology of race. One of the major arguments that comes forth in Go's piece is that the sociology of race and post-colonial thought have not, exactly, always seen eye to eye. One of the reasons that they have not done so is that sociology has, since its inception, actively served to constitute the racial categories involved in Said's understanding of Orientalism. Also, they failed to address the work of scholars within them who have done important work on race themselves. Du Bois being a very good example. Here I want to outline both of these trends, which will both reintroduce the sociology of race and allow me to explore the ways that sociology itself has maintained racial exclusion. Let's review what you learned about race and racialization in SOCY 226, so I can show you how it relates to postcolonial thought. Patricia Hill Collins' feminist project focuses on Black womanhood and community empowerment. Recall her argument about the matrix of domination, whereby power and privilege are not opposed, but are distributed unequally amongst various social groups, alongside the categories of color, class, gender, and so on. It is on these axes that Black feminist thought has emerged and taken shape, should we care to listen at all. Previously, we had not. The pivotal quote, "People who are oppressed usually know it." Recall that I discussed her work along that of Kimberlé Crenshaw, the first theorist of intersectionality. Intersectional oppression refers to the manner in which oppressions multiply, insofar as those at the margins of multiple identities are forced to explain that oppression in a so-called single-axis framework. To explain this, we look to Crenshaw's example of court cases where Black women could not be certified as a class because they were not oppressed only as women or only as Black, but were caught in the middle. Recall again that I gave you the example of Patricia Hill Collins' books divided in the library as either books on race or on feminism, but never both. Both the court cases and the library filing systems are examples of single-axis frameworks that reproduce intersectional oppression. Hill Collins and Crenshaw focus on the politics of identity and intersectionality. To that, I would add the historical focus of Du Bois. Remember, in The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois argues that the problem of the 20th century will be the problem of the color line. In this week's piece, Go argues that Du Bois was both a sociologist of race and an anti-colonial thinker. We don't need to connect the work on post-colonialism, that of Said et al., with Du Bois. He was deeply opposed to the colonial project, living in just about the worst period of direct American colonialism, the 1890s. In the second chapter of The Souls of Black Folk, I told you that Du Bois gives us a fascinating history of the end of slavery in the United States, looking to the example of the Freedmen's Bureau. Du Bois gives us a fascinating exploration of how freedom was achieved in both de facto and de jure forms. Remember, in fact and merely legally. We talked about the situation of the slaves who were liberated in 1843 by proclamation before the Civil War ended in 1865. What do you do with a whole load of people who have no homes to call their own, no money to buy property, and likely no prospect of employment by their former owners. Such was the problem of the color line when W.E.B. Du Bois was writing that book. Here we can think about Du Bois both as a sociologist interested in the problem of the color line, in the organization of society following the American Civil War, and again amidst American imperialist aggression. From Sociology 226, then, we can say three things about race. First, Du Bois is going to argue that the color line is not natural. As I discussed earlier, it is socially constructed. Du Bois in his day was not classified as black. However, we incorporate him into that group today when looking back upon history. Thus, racial categories are historical. They are also legally established, as we see in Crenshaw, and through Hill Collins, they intersect with other identities and forms of difference. Let's explore the constructionist argument a little more closely. Simply put, the constructionist argument suggests that racial categories do not fall from the sky. They are established. They are established historically, they are established legally, and they are established interpersonally. Here I've included an image of the racial classification schema from apartheid South Africa. This is from Jeff Bowker and Susan Leestar's book, Sorting Things Out. You've probably read the chapter for other classes. With this image, and with the idea of the emergent categories of race in mind, we can say that racial categories are historical and are deeply intertwined with political power, as in the South African case. When we talk about the sociology of racial constructionism, we are talking about how power produces particular categories of people. This is not to say that they aren't real. They are extremely real, but they are not real insofar as they are naturally emerging. What Julian Go is arguing in the piece today is that racial subjectivity would not exist as it did without the colonial legacy. Postcolonialism must be involved in the sociology of race because racial categories are the outcome of that process. We'll talk more about constructionism and the institutional production of race when we move to Sarah Ahmed later in the course. For now, I want to give you some examples of postcolonial analysis in practice. My first example comes from another piece by Julian Go, his 2013 paper, Decolonizing Bourdieu, Colonial and Postcolonial Theory in Pierre Bourdieu's early work. I've included the reference in the transcript if you want to take a look. As I mentioned to you, Bourdieu did his military service in Algeria from 1955 to 1957, then doing sociological work there. One of the arguments made by Go and other sociologists interested in postcolonialism is that we can't think of major works of thinkers like Bourdieu without taking into account their participation in colonial structures. Bourdieu's ethnographic work in Algeria had French colonialism as its backdrop. So too did Durkheim's work in the elementary forms of religious life, albeit in Australia. Go's argument, and I think this is well established, is that Bourdieu's thought first comes to fruition in the colonial setting. We can't think about Bourdieu's fieldwork without thinking about the Algerian colonial experience and French imperialism. Recall his work on the sociology of fields. I looked to wine tasting in the restaurant. Well, Go wants to situate Bourdieu's thought against the colonial field. None of his work on Algeria, or later sociology, Go tells us, can be thought of outside of the colonial relation. This isn't to say it's incorrect or poisoned. Bourdieu was very critical of the French colonial occupation, as Go argues in the piece. But it is to say that French thought would not have developed the way it did without his participation in that enterprise. For Go, part of post-colonial thought means coming to terms with the relationship sociology shares with imperial conquest. What I want you to think about is this. How has sociology sought to naturalize the conditions of its subjects? That is, how often do social sciences take a snapshot of life under domination and ignore the political process through which that domination happened? The goal in Go's piece is not to cancel Bourdieu, rather the opposite. The point is to understand the historical conditions in which it took shape, the same way that Du Bois wants to look at the history of race. Let's look to another example of postcolonial sociology in the politics of reconciliation, closer to home. Here is Glenn Coulthard's 2014 book, Red Skin, White Masks. You should get a copy, and then you should read it. Past its compelling argument about the failure of reconciliation politics, I want to focus on how it adopts and reframes the sociology we've talked about in this and the past course. Coulthard argues against a politics of reconciliation that doesn't take Canada's ongoing colonial nature as its object, and the material conditions that have delivered us to our current state. Liberal politics of reconciliation, he argues, fail to look at the ongoing nature of colonialism in Canada. Coulthard argues that we can take Marx's primitive accumulation, tempered with the anti-colonial insights of Fanon, and make sense of ongoing colonial domination. When I say liberal, I don't mean the Liberal Party. I mean a politics that looks at recognition and not at the underlying oppression on which that recognition lies. We need, however, to reframe Marxist thought in order to do all this. Remember, Marx is a determinist, arguing there is a material reason to history. When Marx looks to so-called primitive accumulation, he suggests there was an initial process that resulted in commodities emerging. Coulthard argues that taking Marx at his word fails to see colonialism as an ongoing process, rather than something that happened so long ago. To suggest colonialism is over is to ignore the ongoing politics of resource extraction, for example. Coulthard also argues that Marx cares more about labor relations involved in primitive accumulation than about the colonial relationship that we can see in the history of Canada and the Indigenous peoples subject to the Canadian colonial state. What I want to argue, then, is that part of postcolonial sociology not only deals with the racial strife that exists in Canada and amongst those Indigenous populations who are subject to the Queen's rule, but also in the kinds of sociology we can use to describe those relationships, much like Julian Go's arguments in the previous slide. Here, we have an argument about postcolonialism and the sociology of race. We have an argument about postcolonialism and the material conditions in the post-colony, such as Canada, and we also have an argument about how to do sociology. That's all the content I have for this week. We did a lot of theory this week, and that's going to be the first thing you're going to focus on in your tutorials. Secondly, you're going to have a mini workshop on structuring papers. I'll see you next week.